As you can see, I now employ a stylist. I also have an entourage, and recently I surpassed Taylor Swift in terms of the number of subscribers. On the surface, I have everything, but I'm not happy. In this very strange and painful time of life under the virus, like others, I've looked for small pleasures that may bring me comfort, but I haven't found any that have had lasting effect. There's something about the impact of the virus, and I'm conscious that some people in some communities are doing it far tougher than I am, which depletes us of spirit and of energy. And so we look for these small pleasures that do not satisfy. There is something about the virus that is killing us softly, and it is reflected in this quest, this hunger for something that satisfies, something that's deep. And I suspect that what I'm looking for is an experience of joy. Now, the reference to the word joy may come as a surprise. It's an old-fashioned word. Years ago, the theologian Paul Tillich talked about the experience of joy. He wasn't critical of pleasures. There were pleasures that were helpful, pleasures that could be associated with joy. But pleasure was often a response to emptiness, whereas for Tillich, joy was something deeply and profoundly fulfilling. And one of the positive outcomes that I can see emerging from this period under the virus is the re-evaluation and the quest for joy. In order to explore this theme of joy in a bit more detail, I want us to take up the figure of Mary. In the Christian Church on the 15th of August, we marked the significance of Mary. Now, before I say too much about her, I need to make a distinction between historically how Mary has been presented in the life of the Church, in its tradition, in its liturgies, and what as I see as Mary as a source of joy and hope. We have to recall, of course, that the stories about Mary, the key stories, occur in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. Those Gospels have what we describe as the infancy narratives. They're the stories about the birth of Jesus. Of course, it's interesting to note that neither the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of John have such infancy stories. These infancy stories about the birth of Jesus, were written much later in the first century. They represent the early church's attempt to reflect upon the significance of this Jesus. If Jesus was so important, well, of course, he had a special birth. And so this wasn't unusual in the ancient world to attribute special birth to a significant figure. And in a moment, we'll look a bit more closely at the difference between Luke and Matthew's accounts. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, however, this took a different turn as the church became dominated by Greek thinking, Greek values, Greek attitudes to the body and to the spirit. And one of the concerns of the early church was the need to establish the perfection or the perfectness of Jesus. If this Jesus was perfect, he had to be sinless. And in order for him to be sinless, Mary herself had to be cosseted in some way. So it's from these infancy narratives and the early centuries of the church that a sanitized view of Mary emerged. She was whiter than snow. She was spotless. She was perfect, and she was unreal. And unintentionally, over the centuries, this image of the Virgin Mary, the spotless, unblemished Virgin Mary, of course, then played a role in terms of reinforcing some really unhealthy images about what it meant to be a woman. There's no doubt that the sanitized Mary played a role in the exploitation and abuse of women, not only in the church, but also in society. It got to a point, certainly up until the 19th century, that the only two roles allocated for women was either that of the virgin, like Mary, or the whore. So that's the sanitized view of Mary that emerged from the early centuries. I want now to go back to the early Christian traditions, or the early scriptures, and in particular Luke's account, where there are those wonderful words of Mary that we know as the Magnificat, which begins with, "My soul magnifies the Lord." Mary has encountered Elizabeth, and Elizabeth acknowledges that something great and wonderful is about to take place in Mary's life. She's overjoyed, and she comes out with this magnificent, stirring song about justice, about compassion, about structures being turned around. Now, just a couple of small details that are really important. In the infancy narrative in the Gospel of Matthew, Mary is almost invisible. She has a passive role, and arrangements are made about her future by Joseph. Whereas in Luke, it is Mary's free choice that she enters into this extraordinary venture of being the mother of Jesus, the Holy One of God. She chooses, she acts out of faith in this way. And in response to her decision, her act of faith, she comes forth with this remarkable song. And the dominant characteristic of this song is joy. There's something deeply fulfilling about listening to the Magnificat, whatever form it takes. It strikes the deepest chords within us. It touches the values. It touches the things that really matter. Justice, compassion. If we were to venture forth in the rest of the Gospel of Luke, we'll see how these themes are played out. The whole range of stories where people on the edge are included. Outsiders like the Samaritans are not only welcomed, but often the Samaritans have insights into the ministry of Jesus. Questions about poverty and about justice are critical questions in the Gospel of Luke. And so Mary, at the beginning of this Gospel, is not meek and mild. She chooses. She makes a decision that places herself in a position where the promise of God can be fulfilled, and that this promise is about the things that really matter. Implicitly, she critiques the social injustices of her time. Explicitly, she acknowledges that this child will challenge and undermine those unjust structures. These are the core values of compassion, of care and justice. These values and the fulfillment of these values bring about deep and a profound and a lasting sense of joy. With this in mind, let's return now to our own time, this period of living under the virus. Many people I'm speaking to and meeting are struggling in all sorts of ways. Obviously, there are some people who have lost employment, some people facing bankruptcy. There are people who've lost their loved ones in aged care homes because of the COVID virus. But to a degree, everyone has been affected by it. People's sleeping patterns have been mucked about. There's increasing levels of anxiety, and there is this resounding sense of emptiness. And it really is like there has been a death, but we don't have the body. There has been an experience of great loss, but we haven't had the funeral to say farewell. What I want to suggest now are two things. That I do think that we need to invent our own funeral rituals. I suspect in recent months that most of us have lost, in some cases, someone or something that we have valued. And because it's kind of crept up on us, we haven't had a chance to acknowledge that loss, and in a respectful manner say goodbye. Human beings are remarkably innovative. We can invent things. And I think it is important that we find ways of ritualising the losses that we have experienced in recent months. It might be writing a letter. It might be carrying out a small funeral in the backyard where we bury a treasured item. But it is important to name those losses and then to honour them with a respectful funeral. In that same process and afterwards, it is equally important to reflect upon what are the really important values that are taking place here. What are the things that really matter? Now, I think this is part and parcel of the process of grief. Anyway, it's that aspect of grief where after we have shed the tears and wrung our hands, we search for meaning. And by naming the values, by naming the things that really matter, we start to prepare ourselves for the rediscovery of joy. Remember, there's nothing wrong with pleasures. We are physical, carnal human beings, and so pleasures are part and parcel of what it means to be human. But pleasures are passing. Joy is about the things, the people, the relationships that are deeply fulfilling. And whilst we live in a period of great restriction, there can be moments, there can be discoveries of things that really matter. It might be the rediscovery of silence, the rediscovery of an old friend, writing a letter or sending an email to that friend acknowledging the preciousness of that relationship. It might be picking up a treasured book that talks about the discovery of joy, giving ourselves time and space to reflect upon the significance of joy. It might be a case of reaching out to someone who is doing it really tough. And in the tradition of Mary, the resistance fighter, not the sanitized Mary, in that tradition, engaging with others who are really hurting at this time. Mary articulated really important values of compassion, of justice, of equity. There can be things that we can do which enact those things for others. And we do them because others matter. But one of the consequences, one of the unexpected discoveries of that kind of risky action is a rediscovery of joy. Well, I think I'm going to give up on the idea of using a stylist. I think I'll just accept myself as I am. I'll disband the entourage. And it was a bit of a furphy to say that I have more subscribers than Taylor Swift. In the end, it's a reminder to myself that the things that really matter, the things that bring joy, are often very simple things. Daily experiences, relationships with people that matter. So the irony is, by uncluttering my life and your life, we create spaces in our lives where joy can be discerned and celebrated. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer and Sustainer, Amen.